As soon as certain key supporters left the system, that team began leaving.
And so what we're trying to do with this proposal is to carve out a part of the ecosystem that is fertile ground for the right people with the right ideas to bring those ideas to fruition.
Who now has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country?
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-futurism.
Welcome back. We are now going to talk about the sort of mission and what we think these labs could really do.
Well, in your report, you say that each of these Lovelace Labs could have some important scientific mission that I suppose is not being fulfilled by the existing university sector. What could those missions be?
Well, so first of all, in terms of the criteria, I think one of the key things is that you have a director who is able to have autonomy and begin evolving and developing this. So it's not like you simply say, this thing at the start is definitely doing this thing. You pick like a slightly broader area and then you refine it over time. So the lab itself is a research process. It's not just doing research, but how the lab is structured and stuff evolves over time. One of the key things we say is that these need to be areas that there's a plausible case that this couldn't happen with private capital, or at least that a large amount of it would need to be non-profit or government-backed. So you're not sort of crowding out private sector money on things that are nearer commercialization. And second of all, that it exists in a space where you make a case that having engineers, scientists, and theorists together in a way that's very difficult to do in an existing structure, that's a core requirement. Now, the UK did the Research Ventures Catalyst a couple of years ago and came with what I think was a very interesting lab that came out of that, looking at how you can drug disordered proteins. So the way you're taught protein biology at school at sort of GCSE is that the protein has a structure, and obviously Nobel Prizes have been given for those structures. It's what AlphaFold does. But actually a large number of proteins don't have a sort of specific set structure, which makes them very difficult to drug. And that's an area where you will need engineers to develop new tools. But you also need discovery scientists testing whether the methods are working. And obviously there's a lot of new ideas that will be needed in pursuing that. So that's sort of it's got kind of a mission, but it's also doing things that is quite difficult for a single lab in academia to do. So I thought it was a very positive sign, actually, that the DCIT officials chose that. Perhaps Laura can go into some of the areas that we were looking at, but what I will say is we deliberately didn't go into this in the paper because we felt that it's kind of defeating the point for us to be too clear about what it should do. It has to grow through a network, discussions, workshops over time, and that's something which maybe Laura can talk about us beginning to do now.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would add is, I guess the purpose of us kind of framing this as like a vision as opposed to like a discipline or field is that we think it's important for the group of scientists to have a North Star that they're all heading towards. And the benefit of that North Star being a kind of vision for the future of a field rather than a very specific ultimate goal is that it allows individual research programs to be jettisoned if they're not working. You can be like fairly agnostic as to the exact route that you take to get there. And you can also, you're much freer to follow serendipitous discoveries when you're not engaged in very, very goal-directed efforts. So you find something interesting, it's sort of orthogonal to what you were working on, but it's intriguing, you have the kind of freedom to go down that route, and you're not like constrained by very predefined milestones. So we're interested in now undertaking a kind of scoping exercise to identify what kind of the future of some existing fields are, whether there are scientists in the UK and internationally who have visions for the future of their field. There are other organisations in the UK that are undertaking similar kind of scoping exercises that are very interesting. So like Renfil has their Big If True Science Fellows, and I went to their event the other day and looked at their presentations, and some of those were very, very interesting. And so I think the way I kind of see this is that Lovelace Labs would sort of slot into this ecosystem that is slowly starting to build, whereby you have organizations like Renfil who are helping to identify some of these scientists and kind of give them that next rung on the ladder to develop their ideas. You have ARIA as a kind of funding body who can support some of these high-risk ideas, visions, and then Lovelace Labs would come in as like the place where you can have the physical infrastructure when one of these promising leads comes to a stage of fruition where you're like, right, we need to bring people together now, we need our engineers, we need the facilities, that's how we're going to really propel this forward. And that's how we see kind of Lovelace Labs slotting into that. James already gave an example of one kind of potential field that might be interesting, just to give another, which actually was somewhat prompted by something at the Renfil Accelerator Day and also by some stuff in the paper. I'm very interested in the kind of intersection of neuromorphic AI and then also biological compute. So whether the kind of next stage in the evolution of AI was you originally were trying to model the brain and now perhaps actually we're going to in fact either just use neuronal tissue, organoids as AI, as compute, or we're not modeling the brain closely enough. The brain is an incredibly complex, it's much more complex than a neural network. There are different kinds of neurons with different functions. There are different areas of the brain that do different things with different compositions. The neurons themselves operate in different ways. So there's a very interesting field of kind of how can we use insights from neuroscience to create new paradigms for AI, and then an adjacent field, which is can we use brain tissue itself as compute. And I think bringing these two, at the moment, sort of somewhat siloed fields together could be a very, very promising kind of bet on the future of compute, of AI, and an area that the UK is very well positioned to take on. We have Madeleine Lancaster at the Lab of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, who discovered brain organoids, and we have a number of other like prominent researchers in this space. So that's what neither James nor I would want to sort of put forward proposals based on what we think sounds cool. That's sort of antithetical to the processes that we set out in the paper. But that's like a flavour of the kind of level of ambition, why you need to mix these different types of careers together, and like the importance of co-location. The one other element that James didn't touch on, that of course it would be nice if we could slot these into areas where the UK already has some kind of advantage, be that because we have the talent, the researchers, core facilities, slots into some sort of national priority area. But that being said, we absolutely would not want these to sort of be shoehorned into what are our 4 industrial strategy priorities, and can we bend a Lovelace Lab to sort of fit into that pre-existing idea of where things are going to go.
We did an exercise like this 3 or 4 years ago, and sort of a couple of things came out. One of them was this very nascent view at the time. I mean, there were papers for decades, but it was very fringe, that individual cells kind of can be treated as agents and have intelligence, and that cells can actually learn. There's a very brilliant researcher at Cambridge, David Jordan, who was proposing this along with Gaurav Venkataraman and others. And since then, you've seen like a flurry of papers emerge showing that this kind of property can exist. Now, that's something where you need theorists to develop these new ideas to think about these problems. You need engineers to develop new types of tools to actually probe in real time the behavior of a cell at much finer resolution. And then you need discovery scientists, again, to actually do the experiments, right? So that's where you bring these things together. And relatedly, it's kind of my own interest and my big career failure was since sort of 2016, 2017, the revolution in neuroscience of having really granular cellular level activity across many neurons around the brain, looking at the circuits. I thought that, along with some others, that this would become applied to the body as well. So like much more granular understanding of the interaction between the brain and the body. So neuroimmune, the gut-brain axis. So back in 2020, we thought this was going to really take off. And you've seen, I think, over the last 5 years, just about every major neuroscience journal is full of that. So these kind of searches can lead to successful, you can be ahead of the curve, but I think one of the key things is you have to be willing to make a bet slightly before everyone else. Because I think some of these things have now taken off to a level that the UK may have slightly missed the opportunity to be a leader.
Yeah, David is brilliant. I say that again. This is the area that I'm working in. So I think like bacterial learning does seem to be this extremely exciting field. That at the moment, this is my pitch to you, right? This is okay. I'm going to make the case that this is why this should be the Lovelace Lab. So at the moment, David is doing a load of manual work, right? He's doing a load of pipetting. He's got a load of bioreactors running. Takes a long time. I want to build large, like automated facilities where you can upload scripts to those, and then they will run on automated hardware, and then David gets his results back the same day and allows him to work 10 times as fast, run 1,000 times more experiments. That's my pitch to you. So if you're looking for stuff to happen, then
I think that's self-evident. Like, that is the future of many fields of biology. We in my lab would spend hours and hours every day, truly possibly like a quarter of our time overall, maybe even slightly more, doing a particular kind of experiment that involved creating a gel and then letting the gel set and then running things through the gel and then analysing the bands at the end. And it was like a very cumbersome process, took a really long time, and absolutely something that we should automate, or at the very least have technicians to be doing. And the reagents that we would order to do that experiment, very specific, very expensive. If they didn't work, they just sit in a fridge and nobody else uses them ever. It obviously makes sense to have a centralized automated facility that has that library of reagents that don't need to be continually reordered and wasted. It improves replicability, because they'll just send you the results back, and the results are the results. They're already online. You don't have the opportunity to sort of fudge them a little bit, turn the brightness up and down the way that you want it to be. So I wholeheartedly agree that that kind of level of automation is the future of science. But I guess, to go back to what I said earlier, I don't think that academia is going to be the place that drives that transition. And if we want the UK to be at the forefront of that transition, that's going to require investment in new areas of the country, new types of institution. I think as part of that process of like automation and the integration of AI in science, I think that there are two ways this can happen. I think it's obviously going to happen. This is the great wave that we're riding, whether we want to or not. And the question is, will we integrate AI into the scientific project in a way that empowers scientists and allows them to do more of the creative thinking and the stuff that brought them to science in the first place? Or will it happen in a way that actually ends up subjugating them in many senses to kind of hypothesis generating LLMs that may, in lots of senses, be compounding problems that already exist in the literature, problems with replicability, problems with things not reproducing. And so I think we have to be very intentional about how we think about how we want to integrate AI in a way that improves the scientific process and the joy of being a scientist, as opposed to dampening those things. And as part of that, that's going to require rethinking our institutions. Of course, it's not the case that this incredible new technology will just slot perfectly into our current ways of working, and that it's not. It should provoke a reckoning.
I think there's definitely a world where you see humans reduced basically to meat robots.
Yeah,
right.
There's that meme about I wanted AI to do my laundry, and so I can write music, not write the music, so I can go and do my laundry. But it's basically that.
Well, it's cheaper. It's cheaper to have a human move a plate from machine to machine rather than automating it, right?
And not only is it cheaper, but the economic incentives are not properly aligned here, such that the research councils pay for PhD students, so our time is sort of free to the professor in whose lab we work. Buying a new piece of equipment, that's not free to the professor in whose lab we work. So for them, it is basically the more PhD students you have sort of free labor, and there's basically no incentive to then spend 100 grand on some very expensive piece of technology that could free them up to do more creative science, because the economics incentives don't align. I think there are lots of similar such cases where the R&D sector does not operate as a market in the way that I think people think it does, because a lot of the incentives are set centrally. The funding all comes from a central sort of body, albeit through different arms. And so the problems with lack of dynamism there are subtly different in character, I think, to how they are in some other sectors. And I'm not sure that we've sort of reckoned with that in our science policy in the way that we should have.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's this view, right, that methods are the things that actually advance science far more than ideas. And actually...
Methods papers are much more poorly cited than discovery papers. Tools that you might build in the lab as a PhD student, often you just build them, use them yourself, and then they kind of become defunct when you leave, because we don't have very good mechanisms for recognizing tool building as part of the scientific process, or for collecting that knowledge and sharing it with other students. So somebody else might well be creating a very similar tool in a lab nearby. Absolutely.
Yeah, I wrote something for SOTA called Becoming a Hardware Scientist, which is about how Hooke and Newton, they ground their own lenses often, and meant that they were so intimately familiar with what their equipment was doing that the advances were because now they could look at something that they'd never been able to previously look at, which just doesn't happen, does not happen.
And actually, interestingly, this is an oft-cited argument against your kind of automation premise, because people say, well, but if you separate the kind of experimentation from the scientist in that manner, won't they miss things that they may have picked up on if they were more kind of intimately, like physically connected to their experimentation? But I don't really buy that, because I think it will always be the case that for every sort of 3 or 4 experiments you need to do that are fairly standard, there's one that is a little more bespoke, which you will still need to do on the premises, and that scientists will still need to do themselves. So it's certainly not a kind of totally separate these processes out and outsource all of your experimentation, but it may well be that a lot of the splitting cells, things that are just routine every day, that kind of stuff is the kind of stuff that I think we can automate while still retaining this connection, which I do think is important between scientists and like the physicality of doing experiments.
Well, we can jump in with Tom Forth's complaint. Tom Forth is a friend of the show.
Long time call.
He is a long time listener and a valued one. And I think his complaint is basically, aren't you referencing a whole lot of people from the southeast of England? Perhaps the money is going to be sloshing around the same old ecosystem. I
mean, I think it definitely. I really enjoyed Tom's blog very much. I really appreciate it when someone like takes that much time to read such a long document and respond so thoughtfully. And I get what I said to him is that the one thing that we care about in terms of location of like potential Lovelace Labs is that it's guided by scientific, where it makes sense scientifically. And that in many cases may well be in the kind of golden triangle, but like it's certainly true that there are bright spots in science in other parts of the country that are currently neglected or not as visible to the policymaker, be that departments that are very standout or core facilities, like infrastructure that are particularly standout. So I think to say that they should be primarily guided by scientific considerations is not to say that they should all be tacked on to Oxford, Cambridge and London, even though it may well be the case that at least one would be in that region. But I think generally there's a problem, as he rightly points out, with a kind of lack of visibility of where the other bright spots in the country are when you're in the kind of London policy bubble.
I mean, Liverpool and Glasgow, right, are these 2 centres for automated chemistry. Mm-hmm. Just like absolutely astonishing. Lee Cronin, hilarious man, who was, it was at the launch who I think said to my friend James, he called himself retarded, and that was why he went into chemistry, which I think it shows a certain misfit and weirdo attitude there.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we emphasise that point in the paper, it's got to be where the scientific excellence is A, this thing sinks or swims on getting good people to come, but also some experiences that I had when we were trying to get ARIA's location. It wasn't London versus Manchester. The Cabinet Office refused to authorise us getting the building for ARIA unless it was in rural Wales.
I was going to say, they're probably going to send you to Swansea or something.
In order to meet certain levelling up criteria. And eventually it turned out it was just a negotiating tactic, but there was a period of time where the official government position was that the headquarters of ARIA would be in rural Wales. Now, actually, partly with the whole Bletchley thing, there is a case for having these things far away from the main organisations, but that just stuck in my mind as perhaps a little bit too much for.
And again, did Boris have a view on all this?
I think Boris wasn't engaged on that issue.
What were Boris's views on the meta-science question?
I think this was happening when this was happening around the Ukraine wartime and the end of mid 2022. So he had some other issues as well at that time.
But Rishi is known for being enthusiastic about AI, for instance, and for being quite instrumental to the foundation, as I understand it, of the AI Security Institute, as we now know it. Did Boris have any enthusiasm for ARIA? Was it just the sort of thing that was going on in the building while he was also president?
Obviously, because the origins of it came from Mr. Cummings, and front page news for several weeks during that time was Dom not being hugely complimentary about the Prime Minister, and at the same time I would have to go into the Prime Minister's office and say, hey, is this Dom,
having been hired by Dom?
Yeah, with his Dom's science project, can you give it your support? And there were some reasons I think that Boris was quite keen to support it, but I would say Boris, whenever he saw me around the building, he would punch his hands in the air and go, science superpower, build back better. And he would also stop me several times. We had some quantum physicists come in and explain quantum computing to him.
I would have enjoyed watching that.
Yeah, and Boris sort of very, very, he gave it his best. He tried to look as enthusiastic as possible. And afterwards, several times he came up to me and goes, James, I've still got no idea what a quantum computer is, but I love it.
That's kind of how I feel about it.
Very Anglo-futurist.
Exactly. High taste individual. I mean, on the topic of the Ukraine war.
What was James Price's role? Because he's a friend of the show and a listener as well. Did he not defend Aria?
He saved Aria. So, how much detail to give away?
All of it.
Right. So basically, Mike Webb, who was a misfit in the Treasury, had left in early 2022, and we realised at that point that we no longer had visibility on what the Treasury was trying to do on Aria. So we began cultivating, say, friends in the Treasury. You might call them spies. And we became aware of a Treasury plot to roll back a lot of the agreements that had been made. And so at that point, we found out that James altered the reporting lines so that everything on Aria had to go to the Chancellor's desk, which meant that we would see it. And that meant that whilst they were trying to roll back all the agreements, we could then write the Chancellor's box note reply back to his officials. So James has organised that whole setup where we were not going to be tricked. But essentially what happened is that been a very, very clever, you've got to give the Treasury some credit for this. The whole point was that there was a single business case agreed for Aria. So it had a business case that basically said, we're not going to tell you what to do. And so I had been told throughout the whole process that a single business case had been agreed. I then, towards the end, said I actually just really want to see this because I want to make sure the government's gone. We're about to leave in 3 weeks' time. I want to know it's there. And eventually someone sort of sheepishly says to me, James, sorry, when we say a single business case has been agreed, we have agreed there will be a single business case. The business case itself hasn't been agreed, which would have given the Treasury the ability to put all its requirements back in under Liz Truss, right? So basically, James, it came to the final day, the day before Boris left Number 10, and we went into a meeting with the officials and with the Chancellor, and the official advice came up to the Chancellor saying, we have two options here. Either you can proceed, we can wait several months and we'll do a business case in the future when everything's ironed out, all the details are known, or you can take the totally unprecedented situation of not having a business case. We don't recommend this. And Nadeem Zahawi said, I'll tick the second one. This is unprecedented. We're going to do it. So if it hadn't been for that, all of the freedoms and stuff would have been revoked again once we'd left. So James really saved the day on that.
Bloody hell, very Anglo-Futurist of the Week award, I think. And it does beg the question, what is the difference between Aria and the Lovelace Labs?
I think they're partners and twins. I think that one of the challenges that Wellcome Leap said to us, which is a kind of DARPA-like entity, and that we had heard from actually universities when we had been doing the consultations on Aria, was that a lot of the kind of core machinery of our institutions would struggle to deal with fast and flexible funding, and that sometimes we lack the environments to actually fund where they don't have a sequencer, they don't have the equipment that they would need for the funding. So we lack those kind of technology-intensive cores that we could fund via Aria. And of course, the large majority of people that would be funded inside those universities would need to get a paper. They'd be stuck inside the incentive systems, and that would be fine for some projects.
So essentially, Aria is like reliant on the existing institutional infrastructure to actually carry out the science, it being a funding body. Although they have, to their credit, experimented with like smaller scale versions of new institutions to help support their work and to help diversify what they're able to do. But they were not originally sort of set up with the intention that they would be able to create the kind of level of new institutional infrastructure that we propose in Lovelace.
I mean, they've done this work, these partners, these research partners, right? So like Almodo Design, Cultivarium, that these institutions that supposedly will support projects. Is that what you're talking about, or are these slightly different?
So they're doing some of that, but I think the managing a lab over like a 15-year timescale is like a very different kind of organization to the kind of lean, very low, very fast turnover that you have inside an ARPA agency. Like people inside an ARPA are meant to be there for a maximum of 5 years and then you move on. So you're almost deliberately not having continuity over time. You're sort of trying to stay dynamic. Whereas if you're supporting things for the long term, you need that kind of continuity. And we'd seen several other like philanthropic people in the US who would set up ARPAs and set up physical labs, and they set up two organizations. They keep them separate. So that was why we said in the paper we didn't think ARIA was the right place necessarily to do this. I mean, it would just be ideal to do it through a different route.
I think you also, like, there's certainly you want complementarity between the kind of program spaces that ARIA is like interested in, and the ideal would be that some of those, when they come to fruition, require a physical institute, and they might be sort of passed over to Lovelace for a Lovelace Lab. But you don't want like total overlap in terms of the kind of areas of interest between these two organizations. And if you start to sort of consolidate all of your bets in this new ecosystem actually into this like mega structure, and you kind of end up with just like a couple of new industrial strategy areas, but you're not actually able to like diversify in the way that you would want to. So I think as James said, I think there are numerous benefits to keeping these two types of organizations somewhat separate.
Yeah, I mean, the risk is you get another Turing Institute.
We in the paper talk a lot about how we talk a lot in the paper about how you would set one of these up in specifics, and we don't name any particular labs as anti-hero examples, but
sorry, the Faraday Institute.
I think the thing with the example you give is you could put Steve Jobs in charge and it would still happen in the way it did, because it's sort of set up to fail in a sense. And the people who did their best to run it, like if you've got 10 different stakeholders all putting in a bit of money, you've got just endless different requirements. You've got to have professors appointed from those institutions. Like the director doesn't actually have autonomy. And that's obviously very different to somewhere like the LMB, where though it's less than they used to, there's still a degree of autonomy that the directors have to make things happen.
James, this is slightly leaning into some of your other interests. There's a book by Hermann Hesse called The Glass Bead Game, which is about this province of academics in Castalia, and they achieve a level of cultural enlightenment and research innovation unmatched elsewhere, and they all meditate, and they're all like focused, and the way that they do it is by remaining separate from the like constraints and the requirements of the rest of the world. And yet the book is kind of about the decline of these things and how they've become separated from the concerns of the world. You mentioned about Boris and the Ukraine war. To what extent are these like purely theoretical or like for the good of humanity, or are they like for Britain? Like, is it, if another Russian offensive takes place, are these labs going to be commissioned to produce drones or stealth technology, or is this like a for the benefit of humanity project?
I hate to disagree with your question, but I think it's kind of a false dichotomy, right? So was the Industrial Revolution good for Britain, or was it good for the world? Was the genesis of molecular biology in the 50s good for Britain or good for the world? I think when we're at our best, we are doing things that are good for the world, but that we capture value ourselves, right? So that's how I would answer it. I don't see the contradiction.
I think like one other element, like or axis, I guess, of what you said is the difference between stuff that is a little bit more kind of fundamental and stuff that's a bit more kind of use case inspired, which is not the same thing as basic and applied. And I think there we were intentional in the report in not like pigeonholing Lovelace institutes into a really specific place on that axis. So like, I suppose you could argue of the institutes that we look at that perhaps the Lab of Molecular Biology was a little bit further towards the kind of scientific exploration, and perhaps something like Bell Labs was a little bit more industrial use case inspired. And it's not at all clear that one of those is better or worse than the other. They're just serving different purposes. And so we'd be keen that a network of Lovelace Labs can kind of straddle that range. And so some might perhaps be more like the LMB and a little bit more kind of nested in fundamental science and applications of, and others perhaps more plugged into the industrial ecosystem and a little bit more use case inspired, all while retaining the kind of fundamental principles that we talk about in the report.
I'd like to come back to something you alluded to, Calum, which is James's interest in meditation. What is your interest in meditation? How does it square with being a man of scientific action?
Well, I think starting in January, this is going to be very much my full-time thing, and it's what I wanted to do since 2017, but I've had some distractions like a pandemic and stuff, but these things happen. Essentially, it came from some issues I had in my mid-20s where I had an operation and got very interested in Zen Buddhism and some of the practices they use there for healing. And it sounded completely outside the Overton window of normality, things like chi and, mind-body connection and so on. But I also saw that science hadn't had the right tools to ask these questions. And again, going back to the sort of Sidney Brenner view and the view of these labs, that if you have the right methods, the right discoveries, and the right ideas, they're kind of synergistic, they come together. And I thought that the connection between the brain and body would take off in a big way. And that was really how I got interested in Zen. But I was also learned more and more about it. They describe the practice of Zen as seeing your own true nature. So that's kind of essentially the goal of that, of religion, if you like. I mean, Zen's kind of a practice, but it's also a religion. And seeing your own true nature resonated very strongly with me as a neuroscientist. And it seemed like it's an entirely different way of going about this. So that's how I got interested in it. And starting in January, we're going to be thinking about how we can essentially look at some of these practices in a measured way with science. And the particular part that I'm going to try and grow a sort of network in is how some of these things that these practices are tapping into for healing could be used in patients with certain mystery conditions, sort of illnesses that we don't know how to treat. It may be a complete failure, but I'm quite optimistic that attention on this is now growing. And you also have things like the work of Michael Levin, looking at sort of bioelectricity, and you have quite a range of other trends that I think are converging. That it's not that these things are definitely true and they definitely work, but I think it's the right time to have another look. So that's what I'll be trying to do in January.
I'm quite struck by the sort of thought that after Claude Shannon invented information theory, he then went and spent sort of decades, I think, working on like electronic mice and getting them, and all of his colleagues had no idea what the hell he was doing. But this is potentially this is the thing that then you're ahead of the field, and that actually the mice turned out to be sort of game playing agents in the way that we would now think about AI. Is that the way you think about this, or is this just like something totally separate?
I think the Eastern traditions don't have a dualism between the mind and the body, which is very strong in Western thought, but it's very absent in their way of thinking about this. And I think that mainstream science is beginning to move that way. So essentially the revolution that I was a small, tiny part of in neuroscience sort of 15 years ago was we could really turn on and off precisely brain circuits on a millisecond by millisecond level, and that lets you interrogate. It's like being able to sort of have a model of a country, and you can turn different roads off, different capital flows very precisely, and we'd use that to probe how the brain works. That's now happening for the body. And I think as they're doing that, they're beginning to see, hang on, this brain activity, the moment that happens, this happens down in the gut. Or the moment this happens in the gut, it's happening up in the brain as well. And so there's really no point at which you can say that these things are separate in a sort of categorical sense. And a lot of the ideas in that space, I think, are harmonious with some of these ideas that have existed for thousands of years. But this is very nascent, so it could all go horribly wrong.
And is it all about, in your view, understanding the human mind, or is there an element of performance to certain kinds of meditation as well? Could it help a scientist do better work, or is this simply kind of an innocent quest for knowledge?
Well, a lot of people find mindfulness very helpful. I think it's all of those things. I think one of the things people are surprised by about Zen monasteries, they think they're like these very peaceful places. So if I say, off to a Zen monastery, they'll say, oh, that's going to be lovely. And I'm like, no, it's 4 hours sleep a night. It's 6 hours manual labor, 12 hours of meditation, and then a bit of cooking. And it's like a very intense environment. But you can function on 4 hours sleep a night if you're meditating that much. So these things have like quite profound effects on physiology that we don't understand. The simplest way I describe my interest in this is there was an interest in mindfulness sort of 20 years ago. There's a whole load of embodied meditation practices that I think haven't been researched, and I think the time to do that is now.
And with the risk with spending a lot of time meditating, or trying to break down your ego, is you become a little less interested in your publication record or the production of science, and you become quite inward looking. Is that something you're worried about? That are you going to retreat from the world and sort of yogi style find yourself in a hut in the woods rather than helping the British meta-science community move on?
Yeah, you're in a cave in Tatooine rather than fighting the Empire.
You had a bit of a crisis about this after that first sort of incident when you sort of felt the kind of ego death, right? You remember we went for a drink and you were wondering whether, I can't say it was his publication record that was troubling him, but whether some kind of level of, I guess, motivation and whether there was an intrinsic link between ego and the will to do great things for people.
You've got to be in Tanha to actually get stuff done, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a pretty crap meditator, so I wouldn't worry too much. I'm not a model of these things at all. You shouldn't be looking to me for lessons on that. But there are a lot of people who are much better at it than me that we can learn from.
What's the Dalai Lama done for science?
Not one Nature paper.
No, he needs to be at a Lovelace Lab. He couldn't get away with that.
Franchise is best.
That publication record wouldn't work.
Exactly. The one paper he will produce is coming out in a few years, and it's going to be an instant Nobel Prize.
He's been thinking about it for this long.
Yeah.
So I was in a lecture or a conference in physiology in 2011 in Oxford, my first ever academic conference, and the opening debate was, is physiology dead? And it was kind of, everything's become molecular, it's all like this drug targets this pathway, etc. And I think you're now seeing a real reversal the other way, that physiology is being rejuvenated in the same way that neuroscience was 15, 20 years ago.
So we could be looking at more control over the body than we thought was possible.
I think what you see is reciprocal, that a lot of sort of what would be called mental health conditions have a strong physical component and vice versa.
Or this is the guts, right?
Yeah, I think this is becoming much more mainstream now.
Even, neurodegeneration research has known this for a long time, that Parkinson's can start in the gut and travel up the nerves to the brain.
But we haven't had the tools to actually probe that in a serious way for it. There's been a lot of hints for over 100 years about this kind of thing, but the experiments have been extremely difficult to do.
What kind of capabilities do you think we could acquire?
Well, just as an example, like
Indian rope tricks.
Let's say you take the vagus nerve coming down. How do you just turn on the vagus nerve that innervates this particular organ? Because if you turn the whole thing on, you've got a whole body activation. Can you just turn that one on? And that's now possible with these tools from neuroscience. My friend, I'll do a blog on it shortly, called Virginia Rutten, did an experiment where zebrafish, which are tiny transparent fish, and the reason it's good they're transparent is you can see through them as they're active. And she engineered the cells in the body to fluoresce light when they were becoming active, essentially. So this is a tool from neuroscience. It was in the lab actually that I was in America that developed this. And she said, well, rather than record brain activity, let's just record every cell in the body. And what she sees are these kind of waves of activity around the body where, pulses of activation spread down the tissues in a way that we'd never seen before. This will come out in the Science Journal shortly. And that's just a hint of these new ways of looking at the body. And then you might say, well, maybe these people with this mystery condition have deficiency of this kind of wave of activity. Now, just like we talk about brain waves, I think you'll see body waves becoming a much bigger thing.
I wonder whether actually we've talked a lot about how bad science is, and yet we seem to be living simultaneously through this vast increase in the acceleration and production of science. And I know we're not maybe producing the same massive innovations in that there is not a theory of general relativity, but there are. There is the transformer, and there are extraordinary drugs being produced. And although, despite the Alzheimer's research being fraudulent, there is now correction. I wonder to what extent, slightly to put the opposite case, is this actually the system working? And we've just become very impatient with it because, in some ways, you require it's necessary for these systems. There will be errors. Maybe we have to just be happy with or accept that maybe the Alzheimer's research is just, was an example of a mistake, but now the system is correcting itself. Why is there this sense that this is more existential now than just a flawed system with flawed actors, human actors working in it?
So I think there's a great piece in The Atlantic about this by Michael Nielsen and Patrick Collison. And then there's also Tyler Cowen's sort of account of the Great Stagnation. But if you look at the kind of research endeavour over the last, say, 100 years, there's scale and then there's also efficiency, right? And it's certainly true that the general scientific endeavour has ballooned in scale, but it's also stagnated in terms of efficiency. And so it may well be the case that we're doing sort of more great science than we've been doing previously, but we're also doing a lot more average science, a lot more bad science. We're spending a lot more money for diminishing returns. And so in a sort of policy sense, that's where the real problem is that becomes difficult to defend investments into science when it's quite clear that as a result of largely institutional structures, we're not getting back what we used to get back, and that trend is only getting worse. And that's compounded by other trends which we don't sort of fully understand and certainly are not intentional, like, for instance, the average age of scientists increasing very rapidly, by which I mean professors, or the average age at which scientists get their first independent grant money is increasing. Other trends like lab group size is growing, which means that the pyramid is becoming ever more bottom heavy, and you've got more and more scientists, ideas flowing through fewer and fewer senior scientists, and of course that then makes the career structures more precarious, slower. So there is a lot of evidence that there are various trends above and beyond the kind of quality of the science that are certainly cause for concern and indicate a need for course correction.
Yeah, and the example you gave, transformers, came from Google Brain, Google DeepMind. mRNA kind of came in academia, but they tried very hard to kill it in academia for a long time. And then obviously DARPA was the main early funder of it, which is, again, outside the existing institutions. Same for AlphaFold. CRISPR came from academia, but it was funded through a lab with very different funding structure to the normal NIH grants.
I think there's also like a couple of decades sort of delay in terms of when you see the effects of some of these structures as a result of the career progression being so slow. And so a lot of the professors now started in like a very different era of science, like that the late 20th century was almost unrecognizable, a lab of the late 20th century in many senses to how it looks today, and the same with the broader ecosystem. And so I think we won't really see the effects of a lot of the talent loss that we've been seeing from PhD students and postdocs. It's probably going to get a bit worse before it would get better, even if we made sort of interventions now.
It is striking how many founders I know or hear about who have PhDs, who've gone through this process of, God, that was quite tough. But now, they tack .phd on the end of their LinkedIn and go off and found companies. Like, in some ways, yeah, this new class of like almost overeducated founder, could that be a good thing? Or are you saying that just like academia has to be more than just a training program for these people?
I think a bit of both. I think certainly people who want to stay in academic science should be able to and shouldn't be put off doing that by the structures of science. It shouldn't be the case that startup is the only route available to them if they want to keep doing self-directed science. I also don't think that the UK kind of startup ecosystem has enough absorptive capacity, or that there's enough capital even for the number of PhD students who might be interested in that as a route. We don't have like a large enough ecosystem. In my experience, a lot of people, when they become disillusioned with the structures of science, they leave kind of science or research altogether, because for many of those people it was this kind of romantic idea of what it was to be a scientist, this kind of, I will know something about the world that nobody else knows, and I will use that to better humanity. And if they can't kind of do that kind of self-directed research, then if you have a PhD from Cambridge, for instance, as you say, quite possibly you can make a hell of a lot of money in the city, or you can just sort of leave altogether. And in many senses, some of the alternative career pathways open to you in science can sometimes be kind of the worst of both worlds. You're not making as much money as you might in the city, but you're also not kind of fulfilling this romantic ideal of a scientist that you had, that's what you were aiming for. So I think quite a bit of the loss is in fact a total loss to the research ecosystem, which I suppose the economic effects of that warrant interrogation, but it's certainly sad if we have these people who aren't able to do what they want to do.
What has to happen for the Lovelace Labs to become a reality?
I think there's multiple different ways, and we're exploring these actively. I don't want to sort of, I don't want to say too much about the specific ones. I think one path is government does this, and we're obviously having conversations, and if not now, then the next election there'll be manifestos, and some of the people around those decision makers are quite sympathetic. We'll see what the landscape looks like then. I'll say no more.
A little smile from James.
And
Starmer's calling you a science superpower every time you pass in Whitehall.
And I think also, the possibility of doing this with philanthropic capital remains. I think some hybrid of the two is most likely. I think it's like roughly 50-50. You get something like this by 2030. It's much higher odds than it was when we started with ARIA.
And at the moment, I think we'll wrap up soon. I just want to ask about the focus on the work that they'll be doing. If you have these multiple funding sources, is that not one of the things that you talk about as like the risk, right? That if you've got multiple sources of income, that pulls people in different directions, right? Is it necessary to have a single source of capital for this?
I think it's definitely preferable to have as few as possible, single being ideal. But I think, for instance, in the case that James outlined, I think if you had a kind of government-anchored philanthropic investment, those would both be on the kind of understanding of not applying short-term commercial pressures to the lab. So I think in the absence of the ability to have a single funding stream, kind of a long-term philanthropic donation in addition to government is as close to that as you can possibly get. And I think not sufficiently sort of market-driven to cause the kinds of problems that we outline in the report. The reason that we bring this up in the report is because, of course, people ask, why don't you just raise private capital to do this kind of thing? And competitive market pressures, you're not going to find companies who are going to commit capital for 15 years and are quite happy to not check in, not see returns over the sort of 5-year time periods.
Well, unless you're Google, right?
Well, but then it's not. That's the sort of monopoly point that we made. Then there aren't really such competitive pressures. You can afford to operate sort of, in a sense, functionally altruistically, and you're making these like very long-term bets, sort of fun money for them.
As we said at the break, having this network of fantastic labs is all very well, but we've got to make it that far. In your writing, it seems that you have some concerns about existential risk, so pandemics, nuclear war. Could you give us an idea of how worried you are? What do you think needs to be done at a state level to avert these threats?
Well, I mean, but by definition, we exist in the branch of history where we didn't get wiped out. So you have this constant kind of false sense of security because you wouldn't be having the conversations if you'd been wiped out. I think when you look through the Cold War, there were a lot more sort of very near misses than is really recognized, and people confuse lack of intent with something not happening. So they say, it's not in Putin's interest for there to be nuclear war. Well, it wasn't in the examples we know of the last 50 years. It wasn't in anyone's interest either. World War I wasn't in anyone's interests. The part which I focused on particularly is advances in bioengineering and pathogens, essentially. So it's become, I'll talk about it at a high level, but it's become a lot easier to artificially create pandemics, and the number of people that you would need to do it is trending towards one quite fast. And our experiences inside the government was not only was it not being taken seriously, I was in meetings where they said it wasn't possible, and I would say, then I'd be like, well, here's a paper from 10 years ago where they did it. Like this happens. So you have a system that's not grappling with this, and I think, without going into the whole COVID origins thing, I think the way in which the institutions of science responded to that situation was not good at all, and really imperiled our ability to have serious measures brought in. We go into this in the final section of the Blair Hague Biotech report, and we give some examples of some of the things which are being shared openly. And when you have something where one person or a small, tiny group could create the equivalent destruction of several hydrogen bombs, that I think is a real problem. But it's not being dealt with anywhere near seriously enough. And I put out a blog a couple of weeks ago saying, the COVID inquiry is not fit for purpose. It's not addressing these issues. It's not getting us ready for that. We're spending hundreds of millions of pounds writing a sort of fairly one-sided history book, and that many of the core problems of the COVID response are recapitulated in the COVID inquiry, and you can find it on my blog. So I've sort of kind of given up a little bit and just moved on from it because I spent several years with a group of people trying to get action on it. I think the MPs should do an inquiry into it. I've been having some conversations with some people in Parliament about this. We'll see what happens. But the core issue is that if you can make it easy for one person to make a new protein that binds cancer in order to destroy the cancer, that tool works just as well the other direction, in the direction of harm. And I think it's quite a big problem.
Well, people should read your blog, and I can feel my publisher willing me to say they can read my book on these topics.
His publisher is not in the room. His publisher is himself talking about this.
I'm not self-published, Calum. That's a terrible insult. But I can envisage one like a Lovelace Lab working on things like far UVC lights or advanced PPE. This seems like a very good application of UK scientific talent with state money.
Yeah, I mean, you need the tool builders, you need the experimentalists, you need the theorists, you need the crisis response experts, you need all these people there together. We're a long way away from any of that.
And James, Laura, to wrap things up, let's consider the stakes of this. 50 years from now, what's the kind of Britain we could be living in if everything you want to happen actually happens?
Assuming there's no nuclear war.
Assuming there's no nuclear war and there's still sentient beings on the British Isles. I mean, I think part of the excitement of something like this is you don't know the answer, and you're not going to be able to say this is what it would be like. But if you look at the improvements in our civilization over the last 100 years, from medicine, from transport, and so on, I think you can see. I think the phrase, I think it's in maybe Stephen Roberts' Twitter account, the UK should be an R&D lab with an economy attached. Another way of sort of thinking about the UK's role was actually said to Sherlock Holmes in the TV series by one of his nemesis, who said, the United Kingdom, petri dish for the world. And I think that's actually a good thing, that we go back to being experimenting, trying new things out. Maybe Laura has some specific views on what the outcome should be, but I think at a kind of high level, we need to get rid of the ossification. We need to regain more of a kind of startup spirit.
Yeah, no, I would basically echo that. I think it's kind of recentering science as part of the next chapter of the story of British sovereignty. And I think a lot of the principles that we talk about in this report are not just applicable. Meta-science is in many senses just a kind of a version of like sociology or kind of critical theory, and I think a lot of the principles that we discuss are equally applicable to other elements of government, of the economy. And so I see this kind of move towards Lovelace Labs, this kind of return of agency, different forms of accountability, empowerment of the young, as like part of what I would hope to see as a broader trend for Britain and for the British state.
I wonder whether you've considered whether the existence of some of these sort of middle 20th century institutions were possible because at that time the baby boomers were the right age, that you had this massive generation that never existed before, and whether like demographically we now have the potential to like do exciting work because there are just so many more old people than there ever were, and like the fact that people still listen to the Rolling Stones means that no cancer treatment will ever like be developed again, right?
There's definitely in my more cynical moments, I sort of wonder we're pushing hard against some fundamental civilizational trends towards bureaucratization, everything being hyper-regulated, individual autonomy going down, disempowerment of the young. But as Laura said, that's kind of a motivation to try harder and make an example that it can be done differently. But you do see across many different areas this trend of the problems you see in science being reflected across the board. And I think COVID showed a lot of that in terms of basic procurement systems being non-functional. But again, what do you do? It's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will is the quote. Gramsci, yeah. That's what we have to have.
So we have to bring up the birth rate in order to support. We have to shag for science.
Well,
Is that
it? Silence from across the table. no one volunteering. So maybe there are some listeners here who might. But I think in that case, with that interesting conclusion there, Tom, if you want Britain to be successful, don't wrap up. With that, we should thank both of you for coming up to the King Charles III space station, which we are in, of course, and send you back to Earth, hopefully to carry on the anti-entropic project that you have been fighting the good fight on.
It's a great space station. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Is there anywhere that people, if they want to read more of your work, I should say, where should they go?
Our paper is available at fine internet browsers everywhere. You can Google New National Purpose Lovelace Disruptive Invention Labs. And Laura, what's
the Better Science Project also has a Substack, which has been woefully neglected while we've been writing this paper, but hopefully will, from now, be publishing sort of short asides, a lot of threads in this report that we'd like to pick up and develop, so that's where you'll find those.
She's promising to write more, so get in early. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, guys.
Tom's been relegated.
Goodbye.